Okay, so in the interest of keeping us on schedule, I'm going to go ahead and get started with my talk today. So we just heard from Jim Murphy about sort of basic principles of demand and behavioral economics, and he spent a wonderful amount of time going through reviewing how it's been applied in clinical settings. But where we haven't really talked much so far is how do we actually construct an assessment of demand? And so that's going to be the focus of my presentation today. So we're going to be talking about methods for assessing behavioral economic demand, and we're going to go through sort of the history of that and some of the more current approaches. So in terms of an overview of the talk today, we're going to start with some historical perspectives on demand and where we've come from, and then move into the purchase task approach, which is kind of the gold standard in assessing demand in humans, and then talking about key design elements of purchase tasks, talking about some of the standard things that you see if you want to craft your own purchase task or what's been done in the literature, and then also talking about some novel extensions or new ways in which demand has been implemented. And we're starting to move into kind of beyond the standard purchase task questionnaire into some new realms. So starting with the history, Jim spent a little bit of time on this in his talk, but we're going to kind of recap some of it. So a lot of the behavioral economic demand work in humans originated from work in animals. And so this has origins in operant demand. So Steve Hirsch in 1984 wrote a seminal paper called Behavioral Economics, where he was sort of one of the first to apply these principles of microeconomics to understand operant responding in different animals. And so there's, if you look at his paper, there's responses in pigeons, responses in mice and rats. And off to the right here, you can see an example of responding in a monkey according to various prices for food. So the animal was given 24-hour access to food, but there were various response requirements across those days. And what you can see is a pretty prototypical demand curve here that shows sort of a decelerating value or consumption of food as the response requirement or the price along the x-axis increased. And then, as Jim mentioned in his talk, the study by Winger in 2002, where they looked at self-administration of ketamine, PCP, and MK801 at different unit prices and different doses in monkeys. And what they really found here was that there were sort of the within dose elasticities were equivalent, but Hirsch and others reanalyzed that data and showed that there were differences in the overall elasticity or level of demand across these substances. So then we move from animal studies, and those are just a couple examples, we move from those into the human literature. And what we see here is a lot of this work was pioneered by Steve Higgins, Warren Bickel, and others. And in 1991, there's a study that I really liked because I like to show the plunger system that they used. But Warren Bickel's lab in 1991 translated the idea of a lever press that an animal might make in a study into a human context. And so smokers in their study were able to earn puffs of their preferred cigarette by pulling on a plunger. So you can see that that's maybe it's an updated model of the plunger that they would use, but they used, as you can see here to the right, a fixed ratio scale based on whether or not they wanted 1 puff, 2 puffs, 4 puffs, and then an increased response requirement from 200 to 400 to 1600 fixed ratio. And so what they found is that this arrangement produced demand curves that looked very similar to what we see in the animal operant responding tasks. And then Greenwald and Hirsch in 2006 looked at choices between money and hydromorphone at escalating costs in people with opioid use disorder. And the way that they operationalized cost was effort on a computer task. So they had to do work on a computer task. And they found once again that the escalating costs led to a deceleration in consumption that modeled a demand curve. This research is helpful, but one of the challenges with this kind of work is that self-administration studies in humans come with a number of roadblocks or potential barriers. So there are obvious participant safety and ethical concerns. So providing large quantities of an addictive substance could be ethically challenging, particularly if somebody is in treatment or is in recovery. It would be unethical to provide them, access to alcohol or another substance. Also, large quantities of drugs can be dangerous for participants. There are significant financial and time costs associated with these studies, both in terms of person hours, financial hours, participant time to do these sorts of studies. When you're dealing with addictive substances like this, there's substantial institutional oversight, both from the IRB standpoint, controlled substances, and environmental health and safety. That can be a barrier for this. And then also, if we're dealing with illicit substances, it can be a real challenge to do this kind of work. And also, if we want to study any of this in underage participants, such as young adults who are not legal drinking age, we cannot do a alcohol self-administration study in the way that we would with people that are of age for drinking. So this led people to really come up with innovative ways to develop a survey type measure that was capable of producing operant demand curves without the requirement of actually needing a laboratory self-administration paradigm. And this is where the hypothetical purchase task really came on the scene in the field of behavioral economics. Jim introduced this concept a little bit in his talk, but we're going to really unpack it in great detail here. So the basic idea behind an alcohol purchase task, or any purchase task for that matter, is there's usually a description of the basic hypothetical scenario. We would call that the vignette or the instructions. And that's either done as a paragraph or as a series of bullet point lists. And this is going to define everything from the commodity, the unit, the size, the availability of alternative reinforcers, closed economy. We'll go through all of those components in just a moment, but suffice it to say, there's going to be some sort of a paragraph that the participants need to read to set the stage for this particular scenario in which they're purchasing the commodities. And then there's going to be a description of the consumption modality. So what is the unit they're purchasing, and a list of prices, and an opportunity for participants, as you'll see here, to put in their self-reported consumption at these prices. And then what's done is you use the consumption values at each price to model a demand curve. And that's where Derek's talk is going to come in. He's going to talk to you all about how you can take the self-reported information and model that using various equations, both at the individual level and at the aggregate group level. So this is just some hypothetical data. Once again, you've seen many of these demand curves in Jim's presentation. But the notion here is we're using an alcohol purchase task where we get self-reported consumption at a range of prices, and then translating that into a demand curve. So where did we come from to get here? Jim introduced this in general terms, but I think some of the earliest work that was done with purchase tasks was by Nancy Petrie and Bickel, as well as Jacobs and Bickel. So Nancy Petrie's group looked at hypothetical purchases of illicit drugs at various prices. And the advantage here is it established the basic parameters of the purchase task methodology. So an instructional set, a unit of purchase, substitutability between alternative reinforcers, and also showed that consumption on those self-reported measures correlated with urinalysis. So that demonstrated some of the initial validity of the approach. And then, as Jim mentioned, Jacobs and Bickel took this to look at demand for cigarettes and bags of heroin in people with opioid use disorder who smoked cigarettes. And they looked at hypothetical purchasing at escalating prices. Then Murphy and McKillop, you heard a lot about that. They developed the alcohol purchase task, again, developing a vignette for a hypothetical drinking situation and looking at alcohol demand in college drinkers. And then Matt Field's group in 2006 also developed the sort of initial foray into a cigarette purchase task, where they did a simulation of purchasing hypothetical cigarettes and other commodities as the price of cigarettes was varied. Moving forward a little bit, James McKillop's group in 2008 validated what is traditionally known as the cigarette purchase task. And then other important work in this time frame was a study by Skidmore and Murphy, where they looked at, again, the next day responsibilities vignette. And this is an important benchmark in the field as well, because it was one of the first studies to really have a manipulation in the vignette, where you set a different drinking context. So do you have responsibilities the next day or not? And this also led to work on whether or not you have to drive after you drink, whether or not you have other responsibilities. So this was a real seminal study in that area. And then a study that I worked on when I was in graduate school as Jim mentioned, looked at hypothetical versus actual APTs. So a common question is, does self-report actually reflect what people would consume? And how valid is hypothetical purchase tasks? Well, in this study, we showed fairly close correspondence between what people said they would drink and what they actually did drink in a bar laboratory environment in a self-administration paradigm. And so it was one of the first studies to show close correspondence. It was replicated in a subsequent study that I wrote, as well as a study in people who smoke cigarettes. Moving forward into 2014 and beyond, we really started to see a lot of interest in developing purchase tasks for other commodities, particularly illicit drugs. So Collins et al., Lorraine Collins' group at Buffalo ran the initial study of marijuana demand. In 2014, Brenner and Johnson developed the cocaine purchasing task. And then again, a group that I'm a part of, we're continuing to advance the alcohol purchase task into a new environment and developed an fMRI scanner-based purchase task to allow us to look at the neural correlates of demand. Then Liz Aston, who you'll hear about in the next talk, developed the marijuana purchase task, again, building on the work by Lorraine Collins, but really formalizing this into a marijuana purchase task. Max Owens in 2015 developed the brief assessment of alcohol demand. And then moving forward even more, we have some additional advancements such as a methamphetamine purchase task, an e-cigarette purchase task, and then moving again, pushing the envelope with the alcohol purchase task into daily alcohol demand assessments. And then some of the talks you're going to hear about today during the trainee data blitz, Erin Ferguson and her team have developed the adaptive marijuana purchase task, and then Keenan Joyner is going to talk to us about using purchase tasks in an ecological momentary assessment framework. And that work is either in progress or being submitted. So not surprisingly, this historical progression has led to a fairly rapid rise in the published papers using purchase tasks. So this was just a fairly simple literature search that I ran to prepare for this talk, where I searched for either alcohol, cigarette, tobacco, marijuana, or cannabis demand, and then also a separate search for alcohol, cigarette, or marijuana purchase tasks. Now, these numbers would be slightly higher if we looked at cocaine and methamphetamine and other substances, but I chose to restrict it to these three because they're the most common. And you can see a fairly steady growth over the last, I would say, 14 or 15 years in the use and interest in publishing studies on demand and purchase tasks. With the growth of this literature, what it allows us to do in more recent years is to look at systematic commonalities and also effect sizes across studies. And that's where this slide comes in. So you can download the PDF of this slide, and I've provided citations for a series of systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have been published in the past 2 or 3 up to 4 years. And I want to draw your attention to 3 of them in particular from the context of methods. So there was a meta-analysis that I was a part of that was first authored by Brent Kaplan, who's actually joining us today. And it looked at a methodological systematic review of the alcohol purchase task. Derek Reed, who you'll hear from later today, did a similar type of analysis with the cigarette purchase task. And then Liz Aston, who you'll hear from next, did a comprehensive review of the marijuana purchase task. And then down at the bottom, we have a couple other meta-analyses and systematic reviews, including one by Justin Strickland, looking at various commodities. So not just alcohol or tobacco or marijuana, they kind of tried to review the literature in a more comprehensive sense. So definitely check out those 3 that are highlighted by the arrows there as a good methodological starting point for getting into this area. So what do those meta-analyses and systematic reviews tell us about purchase tasks? Well, the news is both good and bad. The news is good in that there's a large number of studies and people are really starting to use these purchase task assessments in a variety of situations for different research designs, different research questions. But one of the challenges is the substantial heterogeneity in methods that are used across those studies. So you may be asking, as somebody who might be new to this field, is there a standard purchase task configuration that I can use if I'm trying to kind of add this to my battery of assessments in my study, or if I'm trying to implement it in more of a primary care or a treatment setting? And as the authors of these papers will tell you, unfortunately, there is not a standardized purchase task. So Brent Kaplan wrote, in terms of methods, there does not appear to be a standardized vignette nor standardized price sequence. And then Derek, in his paper, our data suggests that no standard approach has evolved with respect to administering the assessment. So if you look at these papers and you look at the tables that summarize all of the studies that went into the systematic review, what you will see is pages and pages of each individual study and all of the parameters and purchase task methods. It's wonderfully comprehensive, but it also illustrates the heterogeneity and substantial variability across studies. So what I think these meta-analyses illustrate for us is we need two things. We need to move towards standardizing purchase task assessments across studies to the extent possible, as well as increasing transparency and completeness of reporting. So another thing that's striking from a lot of these reviews is not every paper reports every detail about their purchase task. They might leave out important things about the vignette, or they might leave out the complete price sequence and other parameters. When they're doing the data analysis, as Derek is going to talk about later, they may not describe all of the analytic steps in a sufficient amount of detail. So one of my recommendations is to make sure you're being comprehensive and transparent. An advantage of these two papers is that in the discussion, both Brent and Derek and their teams try to offer some guidelines or some recommendations for where to kind of standardize. And I'm going to talk about some of those in a moment. But if you're curious, you can look at the discussion sections and they provide some recommendations, again, with the goal of moving the field more towards standardization of purchase task assessments. In terms of purchase task design elements, in her systematic review, Liz, who you'll hear from next, has a quote that I like a lot. And I've put it here in its entirety and highlighted a few points for you. So she writes that the measurement considerations are crucial in the development of substance purchase tasks. And the critical elements are the instructional vignette, choosing the optimal unit for purchase, purchase and consumption time frame, substance specificity, environmental variables, and task administration. So again, if you're relatively new to this area and you're trying to decide what purchase task to use, and I think those of us that have been in this field for a while, we tend to get these emails of, well, what should I do? What vignette should I use? And Liz's quote here illustrates there's a lot of moving parts. There's the vignette, there's the unit, there's the time frame, environmental variables, task administration properties. But I think it really boils down into three key elements that I'm going to spend the rest of the talk today emphasizing. And those are the task instructions, or the vignette, the unit of purchase, and the price sequence. So we're going to go through each of these in turn. And again, unfortunately, I can't give you a prescription for how to do this in kind of a gold standard way. There's a lot of variability, but I'm going to give you some recommendations and some examples, as well as drawing on some of the literature that's looked at the methodology and tried to evaluate, for example, what is the optimal price density? So we'll talk about that as we move forward. So these are the three areas that we're going to spend the bulk of the rest of the talk going through. First, we have the task instructions. And if you haven't figured it out yet, I really like Liz's paper. So she writes in her discussion again that the vignette is arguably the most important component of the purchase task. Now, some of our more quantitative colleagues might disagree with that. They might say that your price interval, your analytic approach is more important, and it certainly is. But the vignette is what starts the entire process, what sets the scenario, what sets all the rules around consumption, it sets the parameters of what, in terms of the closed economy and everything that goes into it. So I would agree with Liz here that the vignette, in my opinion, is the most important component. And so it describes the situation and all of the other important details. And work by Jim Murphy's graduate students and others have really shown that subtle variations in the vignette, whether or not there's a responsibility the next day, whether or not you have to drive after drinking or using a substance, they have really powerful effects on demand. So you have to consider this carefully. So I'm going to share a table with you here that I've put together, which has some of what I think are the key or important elements in designing a vignette. So the vignette should describe the situation or the time frame. So is it a typical day, a week? Is it a party? Is it a 5-hour period, etc.? It needs to define the consumption rules. So often we say you can't stockpile, you can't save the drinks for later, you're not sharing them with everybody. You're going to consume every unit that you say you're going to purchase. You should know about what income you have. So are you talking about your typical income, or are you providing them with actual money, like a bar tab or a cigarette tab, which we've done in some of our lab-based studies? So they're purchasing with house money, so to speak. Substance details. Liz is going to talk about this in her presentation about when it comes to cannabis. This is a central important part of that is the preferred brand, the type, the size, the unit. External contingencies. Is it state versus trait? Are you asking them to make purchases on sort of their typical behavior or right now in this moment? You should assume that you don't have access to other substances and you're not going to use any other substances before and after. Are the choices purely hypothetical, or are they maybe going to receive one later? And then are you putting any sort of consumption limits? So up to 10 drinks. So for a laboratory-based study, you can't give them free access to alcohol. You have to put a consumption on it. You have to put a consumption limit on it. So that's where that comes in. Another important take-home point here is we strongly recommend that you include attention checks after the vignette. So you provide a paragraph to your participants. Do they actually read it? The only way you can know that is to ask them some questions about the scenario. So often we'll say, are you allowed to share the drinks? If they say yes, they didn't read it or they didn't fully understand. So you can look back at some of the previous papers or email me if you want examples of what those attention checks might be. Moving towards standardizing the vignette, this is where the two systematic reviews by Brent Kaplan and Derek Reed come in. In their supplemental materials, which you can download through the journal websites, they've actually tried to provide a standardized vignette for the alcohol purchase task on the right. And I guess that's backwards, excuse me, alcohol purchase task on the left, cigarette purchase task on the right. So the arrows are switched there. And so they go through the key elements that the vignette needs to have and argue that this provides both. They have examples for both state and trait-based purchase tasks. So kind of typical situation versus right now. So I would encourage you to look at those as starting points. But the main take-home point that I would give you in this section of the parameters is no matter what vignette you use, please report the full vignette in your methods section or in an online supplemental materials. There's been an accumulating amount of research that suggests that so many of these little factors can impact participants' preferences and their consumption. And so if the person reading your paper doesn't fully understand the situation or the context, they can't fully evaluate the levels of demand that are observed. So with the increasing availability of online supplemental materials, there's really no reason that you can't provide the full vignette in your methods. So that's the take-home point from that section. The next key element of a purchase task design is the unit of purchase. And this is really important, especially for when we get into illicit substances and kind of outside of alcohol and cigarettes. But there's essentially three key elements here. The first is substance specifics. So we often say to participants, you're purchasing your preferred type or your preferred brand of cigarettes, your preferred alcoholic beverage, whether that's a beer, wine, liquor drink. We also will tell you about the quality of it. So in cannabis, this is important. So you'll hear about high quality cannabis, sort of medium quality cannabis. And Liz's work, when she talks about the focus groups that she's done, will have some bearing on this, as well as the formulation. So is it dry cannabis? Is it cannabis concentrates, et cetera? All of that needs to be specified so that the participants fully understand what they're purchasing. The unit size is also critically important. So you want to make sure that it's standardized, and so participants understand what is the unit of purchase that they're being asked to report. So in alcohol, we often talk about standard drinks, but if it was a laboratory study, we might be talking about mini drinks, so drinks that are half to 2/3 the size of a regular standard drink. Cigarettes versus packs. With cannabis, Liz is going to have a whole story to tell you about hits versus joints versus grams versus puffs. But what we've started to do in my lab and others is to actually provide some visual guides for participants. So we have these photos that are exact measurements of standard size drinks for beer, wine, and liquor. Liz's marijuana purchase task uses pictorial representations with a bottle cap as an example of different sizes. And she's going to tell you about how all of that was developed. The choice format is also important. So are you going to ask them about quantity? So how many drinks, how many hits? Or are you going to ask them more recently about probability of purchase? So in this case, the question is framed a little bit differently. The question is, what is the likelihood that you would buy 1 unit on a scale from 0 to 100? Where instead of modeling quantity consumed, you're modeling probability of purchase of a single unit at that price. And Roma et al. Did a really elegant study where they looked at quantity of purchase versus probability of purchase. And for certain big ticket items, it really made more sense to do probability of purchase. For example, refrigerators. You're not going to buy 10 refrigerators, but the probability of purchasing a refrigerator at a given price is a valid response. And so there's increasing interest in using probability of purchase instead of quantity of purchase. But again, in the interest of giving you some take-home points, it's just important that you be explicit with the units that you're using. And as Liz is going to share with you, if you're not sure about units or the optimal size or commodity, you should maybe explore some qualitative methods or focus groups. So she's going to tell you about that. I know that with one of the tanning purchase tasks that I collaborated with Derek Reed on, there were some focus groups around how should we word these questions. Actually asking people, is this a realistic unit of purchase? Is this a realistic commodity? Is very helpful upfront to make sure you're making informed decisions about the design of your purchase task. The third element is critically important, is the price sequence. So this is a figure from the cigarette purchase task systematic review by Derek Reed, which I've never seen a figure like this, but every time I see it, I really enjoy looking at it. So what Reed and colleagues did is they looked at the exact prices that were assessed in all of these studies that went into their systematic review. So these are all individual studies. And if you see a gray box, that means that that particular price was assessed as part of that purchase task. And so you can see that, first of all, a lot of studies, but not all of them, assess free as a price. But most of them range, anywhere from free or a penny up to $1,000 or more in these studies. And you can also appreciate the substantial variability in price range, as well as the density of prices. So how many prices are there? The interval or distance between prices. You see some examples here where there's very high resolution at certain areas, very high resolution here, relatively lower resolution at higher prices. So when we think about the price sequence, we need to talk about 3 key elements: the price range, the price density, and the price order. In terms of the price range, this is quite simply your lowest price to your maximum price on your purchase task. And most often this starts at free, but some people will start at a kind of trivial small amount, such as 1 cent. The advantage to using free is that you get a direct measure of the observed intensity. So we advise in our systematic reviews that you should start with free, but then the question is, what's my max price? And I would argue that you should consider market prices, and we'll come back to that in a moment. If we want to look at the alcohol purchase task, this was a graph that I put together based on the Martinez-Laredo meta-analysis. And so what you're seeing here is the minimum price and the maximum price assessed across the studies that were included in that meta-analysis. And you can see the majority of them are anywhere from $9 up to $40, but we have some extreme values here as well. Around $100, $140, and then one study that went as high as $1,150, I think, was the max on that one. But you can see here, this is the frequency histogram for the number of studies in each of those price levels. Most of them were around $9 or around $20 for the max price, but there's substantial variability. So what's driving this variability? Well, one of the things that might be driving this variability is market price. So you need to consider where you're collecting data and how much drinks or other commodities might cost in your location or wherever you're assessing demand. This becomes a challenge if you're doing nationwide studies or multi-site studies. The price of a drink in New York City, it's not going to be the same as it is in Lawrence, Kansas, for example. So I'm not advocating for these types of websites, but We've done this work when we tried to develop a cannabis substitution task, where we actually started looking at websites like priceofweed.com, and you could put in zip codes and you can actually get self-reported prices by people that are using these substances. You can also look on various sort of marketing websites. These graphs are not necessarily scientifically accurate, but they are based on consumer data. So this is the average price for a case of beer across the United States, the average cost of marijuana joint across the United States. Again, the extent to which these are scientifically valid is debatable, but they give you a place to start at least. This is data on cigarette prices by state. And you can see in all these graphs, there's different shades. And the important thing there is that there's variability in the market price. You also have to be careful with the price range that you're carefully considering the potential for ceiling effects. So if you set your highest price too low, one of the challenges is that participants may never reach that break point that Jim introduced us to. So they will continue to consume even at the highest price. And that can cause problems for defining your observed indices as well as some of your demand curve modeling. So you have to be careful with the highest price. This is particularly important in lab-based studies where you are providing a bar tab or a cigarette tab, or in Liz's example, a cannabis tab. You can't provide unlimited access to cannabis or alcohol. You can't provide unlimited money. So it's a balancing act between what's the highest price you're willing to give them in cash and also making the prices sort of market reasonable or fair price. So that's an important consideration. The second one is price density. So this quite simply is the number of prices that you're going to assess on your purchase task. And here you have to balance the efficiency of the measure. So how much time do you have? How much are you concerned about participant burden and attention span versus the need to have higher resolution? So, obviously we would want as much data as we possibly can get, but that can lead to very long purchase tasks that can be quite onerous and burdensome for participants. Again, going back to that figure from Derek Reed's systematic review, you can see examples here both of fairly sparse price density as well as fairly concentrated with a lot of prices where you almost have a gradient of gray. Just to highlight kind of two ends of the spectrum here, we have a study at the top by Arlington George Wilson out of Warren Bickel's lab, where they were looking at real, potentially real, and a hypothetical purchase task in the laboratory for cigarettes, and they only assessed at 4 price intervals. Whereas the study in 2002 that was published in Addiction by James McKillop's group looked at 72 prices because they were really interested in very precise and small magnitude fluctuations in price and how that might inform tobacco price policy and taxation policy. So it kind of depends on what your goal is. And so you should consider what your motivation is. Are you interested in very high resolution studies that might inform policy? Then you might need to assess a larger number of prices. Or if you're trying to efficiently model in the laboratory, you might go with a smaller number of prices. This study by Pete Roma in 2016 did a very elegant series of experiments with participants looking at different price densities for different types of commodities. So I definitely would encourage that you look at this, but I'm going to highlight 2 take-home points. The first is Roma and colleagues write that for hypothetical purchase tasks, in order to capture the full range of demand dynamics, they recommend as a minimum of 9 prices, but preferably around 17. Is kind of what they determine to be the ideal price density. But if you need to go less than that, low density 5 price HPTs, hypothetical purchase tasks, were efficient, effective, and did provide orderly demand data. So they talk about this as possibly being a minimum effective price density. But part of the challenge there is that they found that they did tend to provide relatively inflated estimates of demand. So there is, again, a balance there. Moving toward trying to standardize and suggest price sequences, Brent Kaplan's meta-analysis suggested that there are different configurations based on the 9, 17, as well as a very high resolution 33 price version. So again, moving forward, the hope is that we can arrive at some standardization of prices based on a median of $3 per drink, for example, and ranging from free to $30 a drink. And the final consideration with this is the price order. So are you going to present the prices in increasing or ascending order or randomize them? And fortunately, a study by myself and James McKillop, as well as a replication by Derek Reed's group, showed that there was fairly close correspondence between sequential and randomized. So if you're in a situation where you need to randomize the prices, such as in a brain imaging environment where you need to randomize the prices, you can do so with fairly good confidence that you're going to get orderly demand data. So the take-home point here is to consider the number and range of prices carefully based on the research goal of your study or the goal of your, sort of your clinic. If you're trying to just get a fast assessment of alcohol demand for sort of a baseline evaluation, you might be able to go with a smaller number of price items, price intervals. If you're looking for a very high resolution analysis, you need to increase the number of prices. That might mean that you reduce the number of other questionnaires or other assessments to reduce participant burden. But one of the things that became apparent during these meta-analyses and systematic reviews is people don't always report the exact prices. They might report the minimum and the low price, or they might say a standard price configuration based on this study. My take-home point and my recommendation, again, is always report the exact price sequence that you administer so that we can evaluate the density, the range, etc. So again, that's an attempt to give you some recommendations or some guidelines for how to design your purchase task. And I want to close today by talking about some novel extensions of the demand assessment concept. So first is the idea of a state-based purchase task. So when these measures were first developed, they often were considered trait measures. So on a typical week, how many cigarettes would you purchase? On a typical day, how many cigarettes would you purchase? In a typical drinking situation. Myself and others have started to move this into state-based purchase tasks. So how many would you drink right now? And this gives us the ability to look at the effects of alcohol cues, cigarette cues, acute stress, nicotine deprivation, acute drug effects, acute alcohol effects, etc. So now we're not asking about kind of a general drinking situation. We're talking about in this moment right now. And so that necessitates some tweaks to the vignette as well as the price sequences. Another priority that's been a kind of recent interest is finding shorter, more efficient demand assessments. So you may not have the ability or the time to assess 20 prices, a full purchase task. Or if you're doing, for example, as Keenan's work's going to illustrate, an ecological momentary assessment or sort of a smartphone-based assessment, you don't have the ability to assess 30 items every time you give them a text message ping because you have other things you want to assess. So this led to the development and interest in what are called alcohol and cigarette demand single items. So these were originally developed by Max Owens, and then my team, when I was a postdoc, worked on this some more to further develop these. And then we also have a cigarette version that was pioneered by Kara Murphy's group at Brown. And the idea here is you're going to go straight to the demand index to the extent possible. So instead of asking about individual prices, we're just going to go straight to intensity. How many would you consume if they were free? For Omax, we know that Omax is a reflection of the maximum total amount you would spend. So let's ask that. Breakpoint is what's the maximum you would spend on a single drink? So again, instead of having to derive that or observe it from a demand curve, why don't we just straight up ask it? And in a laboratory study, we actually found that these three indices, intensity, breakpoint, and Omax, were sensitive to acute alcohol effects. So it's providing some validity to these measures. The last two we're going to talk about are neurocorrelates of demand decisions. So if you are interested in sort of applying this in a neuroeconomic standpoint, there are paradigms now where the purchase task has been adapted for use in an MRI scanner environment. And so obviously you're laying on your back inside of an MRI scanner, you can't speak, you can't really type your answers in. So we had to figure out a way to make this work. And the way we did that was with the number line here, and they use a button box to toggle to the left and the right. And then last, talking about cross-price elasticity. So instead of looking at just the single commodity, what happens when there's multiple commodities available in this market or this simulated situation? So I've done some work looking at legal versus illegal cannabis in both the United States and Canada, as well as some work that Warren Bickle's group has done with e-cigarettes versus cigarettes. You saw the study that Jim talked about with alcohol versus non-alcoholic beverages. So there's, again, interest in not just looking at purchases of a single commodity, but what is the impact of introducing a second commodity into the situation or the market. And Derek's going to talk a little bit about some of this cross-price things in his analysis talk. I think he is. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Again, you can download the slides for all of the tips and the take-home points. I want to acknowledge all my collaborators and lab members, as well as the people that fund this work. I'm more than happy to consult on development of purchase tasks and also to leverage the team that we have at KU to help you with this. So please shoot me an email if you have any questions or want any guidance. But with that, I will go ahead and stop, and let's take a look at the Q&A. Okay. So Paulo asked, have we considered to have an automated purchase task in which the prices are adjusted to the reported market price of the drug consumed to each participant? So what I think we're talking about here is essentially asking participants up front how much they might consume for a particular commodity, and then adjusting the price intervals to better match that individual participant's sort of market price. I'm not aware of work doing that, but it sounds very similar